Hey Stan, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today, you and I are going to have an interesting discussion about compassion. You're a clinical psychologist based in Australia, and one of the areas that you specialize in is compassion-focused therapy, which is kind of like I don't know if you would consider it a third wave branch out of sort of cognitive behavioral therapy that's sort of emerged over the last few years. And it's always been an area that's been of particular interest to me. I think it's really fascinating in its approach and how it's sort of founded in a combination of evolutionary science and Buddhist psychology, as well as sort of traditional psychological science and principles. And it's really cool to get to talk to you. So, thanks for being here.
That's actually, very, very good summary to begin with, actually. Yeah, that's right. The thing I love about it, and I hope we get to touch on all these different bits, is just the way that Professor Paul Gilbert, who really is the founder of CFT, has managed to integrate a number of number of the sciences, the evolutionary science, the psychological sciences, as along with the spiritual traditions. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting to me as well is how there's so many different modes of psychotherapy that are out there. I think someone estimated that it's like near 500, which is kind of a crazy number. And that it's interesting how, clearly we haven't gotten to a place yet where there's a one-size-fits-all solution. Otherwise, that would be prevalent everywhere, right? And these schools of thought seem to evolve from a need, right? And it's often in one theory that might be lacking a certain, area that it addresses or doesn't, fit all the people, and then a new theory emerges. And if I'm not mistaken, CFT kind of came out of that way of approach as well, where, Gilbert was kind of like, couldn't, do you have a good idea of sort of like how he came to this approach?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is interesting that we have all of these different approaches, and there's obviously a lot of overlap too amongst them all. And then there's certain little unique elements. I think what happened with Paul, he was a cognitive behavioral therapist, really, although he's highly trained in a number of areas, but he was working a lot with depression and using a CBT approach with depression. But of course, he was finding that sometimes people were able to do good cognitive challenging. They were able to sort of identify their negative automatic thoughts, for example, and then start to sort of challenge those thoughts or come up with some counter kind of ways of thinking about the topic. But the problem was that they still did it in a particular voice tone. They would still do the new ways of thinking, but with a critical voice. So, they would sort of say, don't be stupid. Of course you have friends. People do love you, or something like that.
Yeah.
But it would come across with this tone. And he really identified that there was something important in the tone. The tone with which we approached ourselves, when there was this harsh or critical tone, it seemed to still perpetuate things like, shame and other elements that are kind of in there with depression. So that was really where he began, I think, was in trying to work with people to shift the tone of their inner voice to something more caring.
Right.
And it's very interesting with tone of voice, like if I sort of go, that sounds a little bit like maybe curiosity. But if I go, then all of a sudden there's a little bit of doubt creeping in. And then if I go, now we're actually getting critical in our tone of voice. So it's subtle, but humans really pick up on those nonverbal subtleties. And so he was working with that, warming up the tone, creating a sense of caring. And then at some point, the notion of caring shifted into this notion of compassion and taking a
Mm-hmm.
compassionate approach to oneself and others.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how, like to me, when I first came across the idea of the tone with which we speak to ourselves, it kind of doesn't seem right, because you're like, there's no tone, it's just my thoughts, right? But really, if you just reflect on it for a few minutes or in a given example, there clearly is a way that you're approaching it, and the words themselves are arguably secondary to the tone with which it comes out, right? And I mean, I guess mental tone might be a better way of describing it, because it's not like the sound is necessarily there, although there's a question about whether you can, think of sounds. Is that the same as hearing sounds? It's a different question. But it's a really powerful observation that I think he made, where it doesn't help enough to just challenge one's thoughts about a situation if you're doing it in this highly critical or judgmental or condescending voice. And it's really sad that is many of our sort of go-to approaches to dealing with ourselves, right? And it's particularly evident, like for me, one of the exercises that I did as part of the compassionate mind training self-help kind of book was this one of like imagining what your inner critic looks like, right? As if they were sort of sitting next to you in a chair and speaking to you. And then that really sort of personified this inner critic. And, is it a person? Are they big? Are they small? Are they mean? Are they, a bully? What are the different characteristics? And sort of going through that exercise really helped me see how I'm actually speaking to myself, when I was able to sort of like personify it into something that didn't just feel like me.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say from what you've mentioned there, I really like the phrase mental tone, actually, because I've also, like, I guess I use the phrase inner voice tone just to try to explain it in a sense.
Yeah.
But actually, mental tone's nicer. I think I'll adopt that one. Thank you.
Go for it.
Because it's kind of, it's still tone, but it's not necessarily literally voice tone, although it can still represent itself like that. But it's something in the kind of it's just textured. The mental experience is textured with often criticism, as you say. Sometimes we do actually vocalize, just yesterday I went down to my car and, you forgot your keys sort of thing, so that it came out of my mouth with this critical tone. It's not so much the words, it's the tone, You forgot your keys, that might have been nicer, but so I really like that phrase. And the imagery work. We begin with some of the body-based work, which might be the things like body posture, facial expression, voice tone or mental tone, as you say, and some of the soothing rhythm breathing and those aspects. And then we might also move into imagery work. And one of the really set pieces in CFT, a little bit further along the track is when it might happen, but is using imagery work around the critic and being able to kind of imagine this critic and what they might look like, what their tone might be, the sorts of things that they might say to us, the sorts of feelings that they might have for us, and really starting to identify the function of this critical self. What function does it really play? We think it motivates us, or we think it keeps us on track, or we think it stops us from getting lazy or lax with things. But when we do an exercise like that and we really start to become acquainted with this critical self, it really becomes clear that it functions in a very different way. It often is demotivating. It often makes us feel worse about ourselves. We're more likely to procrastinate or even give up on things, when that critical self starts running the show. And so, yes, that's a really useful example of imagery, and starting to disentangle these different parts, and then starting to work with these different parts like the critical self.
Right. And I suppose it's also, this is the great point to sort of introduce that, we sort of have multiple selves, right? There's one way of thinking about the construction of our mental faculties is of having sort of sub-personalities or different selves. And, for me, it became very apparent when I was like, how can I have two opposing thoughts about something? How can I be both, or contradictory rather? And I'm like, but if I'm just one thing, then that wouldn't really make sense, right? And it's weird to think about it that way for a little bit. Not weird in a bad way. It's just, for me, it was a very unusual experience. But it really showed me that, like, oh, well, there's a part of me that's highly critical of myself and others and whatever. And then there's also a part that's highly compassionate, right? And in my case, it tended to be more outwardly focused. And, I would never speak to my friends or family or even think about speaking to them that way, the way that I would sort of typically talk to myself. And then it was just a matter of like really working with how do I then talk to myself that way. And one of the sort of interesting things that I wanted to sort of get your opinion on was, to define compassion is quite difficult, right? Because it's kind of an abstract-y concept by itself. And there are very good definitions of it having different... So I guess maybe let's sort of start off there. Like when you talk about compassion with your clients, let's say, or in a training seminar, how do you define compassion?
Yeah, a lot of great stuff again in what you were saying. I hope we perhaps get back to the multiplicity stuff too, because that's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, we can go to that now. Sorry, I tend to jump in thoughts quite a lot.
No, that's all. It's just exciting stuff. I get a little bit excited talking about it. But no, I think it's actually a good idea to define compassion a little bit, because that's a little bit at the foundational, isn't it, in terms of where we're going. I think one of the really useful things though to do clinically or with our clients is always, we're wanting to do a kind of a guided discovery around things like that, where we actually might really just pose it as a question first of all. What is compassion, or who is someone that has been in their life that they might think of as compassionate, or who are some of the stories out there of certain individuals around the world, perhaps considered compassionate, and then what are the qualities or the attributes of those people. And it's very interesting. People often will come up with a lot of good stuff. They'll talk about things like caring or kind, or they'll talk about things like empathy or understanding, or they'll talk about things like common sense or wisdom, or and actually it's a really useful thing just to get everyone's take on what perhaps compassion is. And usually in amongst all of that, there'll be, just really important wisdom that we can then bring to perhaps a more formal definition. A CFT definition, of course, is compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. And so we've got these two halves in a way. There's the sort of the sensitivity half, this sort of sensitivity, awareness, noticing, engaging with suffering. That's kind of the first half. We think of that as compassionate engagement. So a whole lot of stuff comes to compassionate engagement, not least things like empathy, sympathy, distress tolerance, non-judgment, and so on. There's a number of aspects to compassionate engagement. And there's a few things that's interesting there. Compassion is about suffering. It's a bit different to kindness in that way. We might be kind, and kindness might be a part of compassion, But kindness doesn't have to mean suffering, whereas compassion is about a sensitivity to suffering in particular. And it's about self and others. And that's often a little kind of, oh, okay, the people are sort of, interested in that bit. They're not sure about it sometimes, like they get compassion for others, but this idea of self-compassion can sometimes, raise a few eyebrows when we're talking to people about it. So that's the compassionate engagement piece. And then with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it, that's the compassionate action piece. That's where we sort of tap into wisdom, we tap into strength and courage, and we try to think, what is it that I could do that would be helpful? What is it that this person or myself really needs right now that would help to alleviate or prevent suffering? And that's the sort of the general definition. Then there's a whole bunch of little components that fall under that.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I really like that. In your therapeutic practice, you don't sort of just give the definition, being like, "This is what compassion is. Now let's work with it." It's more like, well, what does it mean to you as a client, let's say, and because that's arguably more important and more powerful for that individual. If you're constructing a treatise on compassion, it's different territory, but in the counseling or therapeutic context, it's about the client and their world, right? Like what's important to them, and so it's important to figure out what it means to them. And then, obviously with some guided exploration, there's added elements you can incorporate. Like, for example, the idea of so there was compassionate engagement, you said, and then it was a compassionate action.
That's right.
Was the other half, yeah. And that's a really, I think it's a tremendously powerful insight to know that this isn't easy stuff, and it's not just observing suffering and feeling empathy for it, because while that's important, it's not really enough. In what we're talking about here, it requires wise action, and to do that often requires courage and strength and fortitude and resilience and all of these very, positive attributes that we sort of work towards having. And it's difficult a lot of the time because life's not easy, and there's a reason people are suffering. And there's great challenges in the world. If they were easy to solve, they wouldn't be around so much, And so I think it's a really important point, and it sort of, for me, highlights the action piece of it, right? But I want to actually just ask about, this idea of wisdom, right? Because, excuse me, there is this sort of assumption, and I think it's a valid one. I'm not questioning the assumption, but it's very interesting that there's this idea that, we all have wisdom within us, right? That I don't know what the right way to phrase it is, but it's perhaps that we can access, or that we allow to express, and that we sort of carry out the action that's intended from it. But it's interesting that that's not our default way of doing things, right? Because we kind of know that what's the right, quote unquote, right thing to do, what would be the best for us or someone else. And yet a lot of the time we don't do those things, right? And yet I would think that if we would appreciate that is real, true wisdom, something sort of beyond our sort of individual mind and capacity to comprehend, that it would be obvious for us to take that path, and yet we don't. What do you make of that?
Yes, I was working with a fellow just recently, I think it was last week sometime, and he had this little moment. He said to me, I know what I should do about, this, my depression that we're talking about. And he goes, but I always seem to do the opposite.
Yeah.
And I think that's, we all are a bit like that. It's sort of, often we know what we should do, but we don't know whether we can, or we feel like we could do it, but we don't really want to, or there's a lot of complexity to those kind of, well, to motivation generally, but to a compassionate motivation or a self-compassionate motivation as well. We can feel a bit torn around all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom is certainly one element of compassion, and the wisdom to be able to notice and engage with suffering, the wisdom to take helpful action. In CFT as well, it's the wisdom of the tricky brain. It's the wisdom of understanding that we have these evolved brains that were or are exquisitely designed to help us to survive and reproduce, really, is what they're designed to do, and they do that very well. It's just that, they come along with trade-offs as well. Our brains also, can cause a lot of suffering. Evolution doesn't seem to have been so worried about our happiness. It's particularly worried about our survival. But there can be these trade-offs. So that's a key part of the wisdom too, is just that insight and understanding of the tricky brains, the way that our brains were designed for us, not by us. And that they come along with a bunch of trade-offs that can cause us a lot of suffering. And so in CFT, we really talk about, our suffering is not our fault. This is the no blame, no shame wisdom of compassion and CFT. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility or even our opportunity. There are things about our brains that are also we're able to learn and change and grow as well. And so there's both of those sides, and that's kind of the wisdom piece. But I think the other thing about your question, which is really interesting to contemplate, is that we have three key qualities to compassion, at least in CFT, and they all work together. So we have the wisdom piece. But then the second piece is really strength and courage, because it takes that as well. Like, we might know and have this awareness around the wisdom of perhaps what to do next or what might be most helpful for ourselves or others. But then the next bit is the strength and courage, to approach all of that and to have that sense of groundedness, stability, stillness inside ourselves, confidence, emotional courage. So we're really trying to cultivate that aspect of compassion as well. And then the third key quality is commitment. Is really a caring commitment, a sort of a commitment to act in ways that are caring, supportive, reassuring, encouraging, helpful, or whatever. But that's sort of the commitment is the next piece. And I think it's really nice how those three key qualities really support each other. We can have the wisdom, but then we need the strength and courage. We might have the strength and courage, but then we need the commitment to be helpful that goes along with that. And then we might have the commitment to be helpful, but we need the wisdom to inform that. So it's all three of them really help to support compassionate engagement and compassionate action.
Right. And I suppose, what we're sort of working up against, at least a lot of the time, is fear, right? It might not be overt fear, but, I sort of imagine you can reduce a lot of the reasons down to fear about why we don't do the things that we know we should do or probably should do or whatever it is. And, so that's where those sort of three things, for me, make sense that they meet, right? It's like, well, okay, we know the wisdom piece, so like, I know I should do this or shouldn't do this. Now, it takes courage to face that fear and to deal with those emotions as they come up and not avoid them and not suppress them and not reject them. And then commitment to sort of keep doing it, because doing it once doesn't necessarily change your whole life, particularly if it's a pattern of behavior or cognition that you're trying to change, right? And so it's, for me, that's how I sort of think about those three aspects that you just said. Is it's like, well, yeah, and it makes sense in action, right? In terms of facing fear, which is a really strangely difficult thing for us to do, even small fears, right? And this is actually sort of an interesting point, like, that in CFT, there's often talk about these sort of three main emotional regulation systems.
Yes.
Right. Could you give a little, just before we go on, like a little brief of what those three are?
Yeah, well, you're really referring to the threat system, first of all, which is the first emotion regulation system, the first circle, often coloured red when we draw it up on the whiteboard. But the threat system really is that kind of fight, flight, freeze, appease system. And like you also mentioned, it's kind of better to be safe than sorry. And so the threat system is quick to react. We don't tend to need to practice threat system. It's really evolved to be probably the primary system, and it needed to be. If there was a lion stalking us or something, we don't want to be kind of looking at the lovely sunset. We want to be looking at the lion and focusing on that and making sure that we're, it's got a threat protection motive. And then the second system is the drive system, which is, like if the threat system had its way, it would just keep us safe and warm in the cave, I guess. But we couldn't just stay in the cave. We had to go out and get stuff, get food or find a mate or get resources and so on. And so that's the drive system. The drive system really is about wanting and pursuing and obtaining, having success, achieving things. Which is tricky too, as you can imagine. It's useful and helpful and motivational and so on. But sometimes it can become quite competitive. We can start to get into zero-sum games with people where it's a winner and a loser. And, the drive system and it's a bit insatiable, we might achieve one thing and we don't really stop at that. We then just want the next thing, and so on. And of course, threat and drive have an interesting relationship too, because, the prehistoric person might have been walking along the bush or something and they hear a rustle off to the side, and the first thing that kicks in is the threat system. Oh my God, that's something that's going to eat me. And then the next thing is the drive system. Oh, that could be something I could eat. So then all of a sudden, do I dive in there or do I get the heck out of here, sort of thing? And we feel stuck, and things like procrastination are a part of that, and then sometimes we use our drive system to try to cope with threat system. We're feeling very threatened about something, and so we get the drive system and we kind of plonk it on there, and that might be things like perfectionism and self-criticism comes in at that level. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit more detail there, but those the threat and drive systems are sort of kind of powerful. But of course, as humans, we weren't overly big and strong and able to fight off a threat, and we weren't overly fast and unable to run away from a threat. But what we had was each other, and we looked after each other. Like a lion stalking us, and half a dozen of us there or whatever, we could probably shoo the lion off, just on our own, and we were dead, sort of thing. And so we formed this third emotion regulation system, which it's called the sort of soothing affiliative system. It's really about that sense of feeling calm and soothed and so on through our affiliation or connections or a sense of belonging with others. And the threat system is the red circle, the drive system is the blue circle, and this is the green circle. And often in compassion, we're working a little bit there. How do we cultivate that sense of safeness? How do we help people develop certain skills to feel kind of soothed and so on, to soothe others, but also to soothe oneself? And it can be a tricky one. Sometimes the soothing system does need a bit of practice because it depends on our life experiences, how we were cared for, our attachment experiences, our relational experiences growing up. And so sometimes the soothing system can feel a bit compromised. And that's often where we begin with CFT, really, is to see if we can grow the green, so to speak. We can sort of develop the soothing system. So
right.
yes,
it is something that can be developed.
Yes.
Right. Like if you feel like you're not overly compassionate, or it's difficult to engage, in that sort of social warmth and connectedness, it doesn't mean that that's the end of it for you. It's certainly something that can be worked on.
Absolutely. And there are some really helpful strategies, some of the body-based strategies, certain imagery strategies, as we were saying before. These things can be very helpful when it comes to cultivating the soothing system, that sense of safeness. But your point before is absolutely right, and that is that oftentimes we're trying to sort of also work with threat system activation. And one of the things that can really get in the way of soothing system and can get in the way of compassion as well is certain fears that might arise out of that threat system. And this is probably one of the other big contributions from Professor Paul Gilbert, is just this realization that we do have various fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. Things that get in the way of maybe being compassionate towards others, but also things that get in the way of receiving compassion from others. And this is often something for clinicians and therapists and so on to think about, because, often we're not immune to that. We worry about, if I let people know that I'm struggling, maybe they'll think I'm not a good clinician. Maybe they'll think I'm not a good therapist. And we have these fears, blocks, and resistances to receiving compassion. And then, of course, we have fears, blocks, and resistances to self-compassion as well.
Would you say that that's probably more common than the others, of the sort of the fear of self-compassion in your experience?
I've found both receiving compassion from others and self-compassion are often the two that we sort of might be working with the most. The compassion for others, lots of the people I work with are very strong on compassion for others. Often they're very kind people, very, sort of generous. They're very caring towards others. They even put others first and become a little bit self-sacrificing. And so, oftentimes the flow of compassion for others is quite strong. And the other two are much, much more difficult. There are real sort of inhibitors there, barriers, things that get in the way of the other two. And there's some interesting research that those with higher fears of receiving compassion from others and fears of self-compassion are more likely to have higher symptoms of things like depression or anxiety, that there's a real relationship there between those.
And is that because of the sort of tendency to put others first and, self-sacrifice, and eventually that becomes, more of a problem than just any individual case of it, right? Because if you do it once, okay, but if you do it repeatedly, it's all of a sudden a non-prioritization of yourself, and so you don't treat yourself with the same level of care that you do other people, and then, all sorts of things come out of that, like resentment and self-criticism and the fun things that come with depression and anxiety and things like that.
Yes, I think that's sort of the one part of it, is that we start to get into much more of a habit of being compassionate towards others and not so much ourselves, and some of those sort of consequences start to kick in. But I think too, this idea that people are often actually scared of it. They're scared of receiving compassion, whether it be from others or ourselves. It triggers the threat system. We worry that if we let someone else care for us, what if they take advantage of us? What can I trust them? Or we think to ourselves, if I care for myself and I'm self-compassionate, what if I just become lazy or self-indulgent or whatever it might be? And so I think this is the thing that we often end up doing a lot of work with in CFT, is we work with the fears, blocks and resistances, because if we can soothe those fears a little bit, actually what happens is the compassion across those three flows just starts to rise up in us. It's in there. This is the thing, compassion evolved too. It's an evolved aspect of our species. It's just that the threat system and all of these fears, blocks and resistances can really inhibit that fairly natural compassionate motivation. Shift those a little bit and soothe those fears, and up comes this compassionate motivation.
And I suppose it makes sense too, right? Why fear has the priority and the most sort of power within us, as you sort of said earlier. Is like, well, if survival is the most important thing, evolutionarily speaking, which arguably it would be, otherwise there'd be no point, then fear is what's going to keep you alive, and everything else basically secondary. Even, food, water, mating, all that kind of stuff. Like, if you don't make it through the day, none of that stuff matters. And so it makes sense why fear would be so powerful in terms of shutting everything else down, right? In order to survive. And I suppose now in the world that we live in today, those systems, this is the tricky brain bit, right? It's like, well, we still have all of that hardware and software, or whatever you want to call it. And it's just now applied to non-life-threatening situations that our brains kind of perceive as sufficiently threatening to warrant, control or shut down or something like that.
Yes.
But it's
I was having a funny thought the other day that, it's actually only, I'm not exactly sure how many years, but maybe, is it like, it's only 20 years or something since we've had smartphones.
Yeah.
It's been millions of years since our species has been evolving. And so, the vast majority of the time of our species on this planet, has been us really needing to survive in a very threatening, difficult environment. And so, yes, these sorts of things are absolutely, kind of programmed in. And if you think about it, we're a hyper-social species. That was a big part of how we survived. And so those who were the best collaborators were the ones who were kind of kept in the group, and we worked together. And so I think that's what happens with fears of receiving compassion or fears of self-compassion, is that there's a very primitive part of the brain that worries, what if I'm receiving compassion from others and they then see me as not a good collaborator? Because if that happens, I'm going to get kicked out, I'm going to be ostracized, isolated, alone, and dead. I mean, it's no small thing, really. It's about life and death, actually, these fears. And I know that we don't necessarily think about it in these terms now, but if we really drill down, that's why we're afraid of receiving compassion from others or receiving self-compassion, is that we worry that we'll be seen as not good collaborators and we'll be kicked out of the group.
And yeah, absolutely. Back in the day, if you were kicked out the group, it was basically a death sentence. Because, as you said, we're small, weak little creatures on our own. And it's very apparent when you sort of go out into some natural park or nature reserve or something like that, or you encounter something like a bear or a lion, you're like, oh, okay, I get it now,
Yes, that reminds me. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so our systems are still holding on to that, where it's like, if I get kicked out or if I'm ostracized by the group, it feels life-threatening still, even though it doesn't seem to conceptually come across that way. It just comes across as immense fear and anxiety, right? We don't, I mean, as far as I know, people don't sort of view it as life-threatening in the sort of way we would talk, about encountering a bear or something like that.
Yes, yeah, but that's definitely the kind of the emotion that it's triggering in us.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings us, I guess, to the next bit with CFT, because in some ways, Paul Gilbert really developed CFT to work with self-criticism, but also to work with shame, which again is a very, this is a sort of an aspect of social threat that we deal with. So we've become very aware of how am I being held in the minds of others. That becomes a big focus, and we worry that we might be held in negative terms, or we might be seen as inadequate or inferior or unworthy, no good. And so we sort of start to develop this kind of external shame. First of all, there's this sense that others see us as no good, and then sometimes we internalize that as just a belief in ourselves that in fact we are no good. And we create that sort of sense as well.
Yeah, and there's this weird sort of dichotomy in I've sort of noticed in our sort of culture is the wrong word, in our society, let's say, where it seems to be the case that everyone has this fear of being judged, being rejected, being humiliated, public disapproval kind of thing, even if that public is your group of friends. Like, it doesn't need to be global public things, but it applies at every level. And yet there's this message that gets pushed a lot of like, you shouldn't care about what other people think. And it's not that that's untrue, because there's a lot of truth to it, in the sense of like, well, you should be the director of your life. However, it makes a difference in how people see you. Like, your life is influenced by the way that other people see you. But unfortunately, we can't know how other people see us other than by their sort of influence and words and what they do. And yet we try our best to imagine what other people are thinking about us, and then get out ahead of it and do things so that they'll have a good view of us or whatever it is, and it causes all sorts of complications. But there's really no running away from it unless you really isolate yourself, which is near impossible to do, and not necessarily a good thing to do either, right? I mean, that's why, the worst punishment that we can come up with is solitary confinement. As rough as it is, I mean, that's really, other than death and torture, I suppose, but practically speaking, that's the worst that we do to people. Not, and I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't do that. It's just an interesting observation, right?
Well, it's just reflecting, isn't it, on the really central role of the group for humans. We feel safe when we feel safe and secure in the group, and when we have good connections and a sense of belonging and so on. And it's an interesting thing that you mentioned before, that we do worry a lot about what other people think. And then there's this message that we needn't worry about what other people think. And then there's this sense of, well, now I'm worrying about what people think, and I know that I shouldn't worry about what people think. So, I'm a bad person for worrying. So it's really tricky. We have tricky brains, and those self-conscious emotions are often a very powerful source of suffering. Shame, humiliation, embarrassment, so on. You know,
and
they're
and
very,
it's pervasive, right? It
yeah,
lasts, unlike other emotions in animals, where
yeah,
it's sort of transient. We sort of keep going for
yes.
the whole time with
We lie
tremendous
awake.
pain.
We
Yeah.
lie awake worrying about it and sort of thinking about how I said this stupid thing and now people are going to think this and that and the other, whatever. And, you know, what if that means that this and that? And yeah, we have very powerful brains that sometimes work against us. And I suppose this is the key, is how do we do that de-blaming, de-shaming of the way that our brains work? Because it's not really something that we've chosen. It's sort of that's just a part of it, and we can work to try to feel less affected by how other people are thinking about us. And we also bring compassion to the fact that sometimes we do worry about what other people think about us.
And that's okay, and it's just a matter of how we deal with it, right?
Yes.
Just to check, do you have to run at the hour?
No, I think I booked in till 10:30.
Okay, cool. Just because I know we were started a few minutes late, so I want to just carry on for a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's all good.
But yeah, so it's really interesting, and this tricky brain problem it's a problem. I mean, it's, you know, it is what it is, right? It's good to accept it, and you know, if you're tackling any sort of challenge, you first have to know what it is that you're dealing with. Otherwise, you're shooting in the dark, and that's unhelpful for the most part. So it's good to know yourself in this context. And it's also interesting, you know, that we live in a world now that is unprecedented in terms of like connectivity and, you know, like sort of globalization and the amount of groups that we are available to be a part of. And that comes with all sorts of pros and cons, right? The pros is there's groups for everyone to find them where they'll fit in and feel safe and comfortable. And then the cons are, well, sometimes it's really hard to find those groups, and sometimes you find yourself in groups that are actually abusive and destructive, and that's not very good. And, you know, but luckily we're in a position now where being kicked out of a group or leaving a group voluntarily isn't a death sentence anymore, right? And it's good to kind of know that, although it might be tremendously painful and difficult because, you know, you have to reevaluate your sort of sense of reality and yourself, and huge changes might be necessary, and that is difficult, but it's possible. And it's sort of just an interesting way to kind of look at it, right?
Yes, yesterday I did a post on Instagram and I got 123 likes, and I was like, wow, you know, like that feels great. And then the next post I did got 6 likes, and I was like, oh,
right. Yeah.
It's so interesting, isn't it? You know, that we are so tuned in to what other people think, and we now have this wonderful opportunity to have connections with people all over the world, and also all of these new opportunities to feel, you know, worried about it and concerned, and you know, especially given, you know, the 2 years of the pandemic and counting, you know, it's just created all sorts of isolation and social disconnection and concern about, you know, the big thing about, I think, the pandemic in some ways is that it's made others, and especially physical contact with others, the threat. You know, that's the threat now, and that just goes completely against what our needs are as humans to feel connected, to feel close, to be able to, you know, give and receive a hug, or whatever it might be. And now all of a sudden we
no contact.
We rock up at home and we see our mum and we're kind of like, hi, and we sort of wave from, you know, a socially distanced, you know, and it's been very, very tricky. It goes straight to the heart of, I think, what we're talking about in terms of this social connection need that we humans have, and the fears that we might have around that when it's not happening.
Yeah, and I you know, my heart goes out to kids, man, who have been raised during this time, who have just basically learned over the last few years that everyone's a threat, right? And it's like, I don't know how you recover from that, but hopefully they can, anyway, but it's what's interesting is like, and this sort of also goes back to what you were saying about the Instagram thing, is it's like, well, so much of how we respond to things is not at the level of consciousness, right? Like, for example, now, if I asked you now, why do you think that your one post with 100 likes made you feel better than the one post with 6 likes? And you could come up with a good answer. And I'm sure it's, reasonably accurate in an assessment. But at the time, you just get the feeling, right? You either get the dopamine hit or you don't, or you might even get, cortisol, right? The stress one. And that's how we learn without even really thinking about it, right? So you're like, I want more dopamine, I want less cortisol. So you're like, how do I make more posts that get higher likes because that feels good? And how do I make less posts that, make me feel bad? And you don't even necessarily need to think about it before you find yourself in this like trap, basically. And I mean, trap might be a strong word. I suppose it depends on really your level of objective understanding of things, but that's how it works. And it's interesting in terms of like a broader context of scale, right? Because I mean, if 6 people came up to you on the street and said, this talk that you gave, it changed the way I think about things, right? It was so powerful, and they meant it, and they shook your hand or they gave you a hug. We're imagining it a little bit in the future here. That would be significant, right? That wouldn't be nothing. And yet, you see 6 likes, and I don't mean to criticize you at all or suggest that you don't have a good view of things. It's more, I have the same situation, right? I think about it the same way. I'm like, how many people listened, or how many people reached out to me, or whatever it is. But to move past it, I just think about, let's say 10 people do something. I'm like, man, if those 10 people were in the room with me and they told me that would be a very different situation than comparing it, firstly, to the more quote unquote successful things, but even more so to other people's success, as if that's relevant, right? Like you see millions of likes and you're like, oh, what's that? But in those people's position, if something gets 100,000 instead of 1 million, they're in the same spot. It doesn't go away. The numbers just change. And the bigger the number, the less we can even really conceptualize what it means to us. But the point of that little like rant, my apologies, was just to say that, like, how things affect us, kind of, we only think about after the fact, right? We have primary responses to things. And what's really important, and what I like about CFT and many other areas, is this element of mindfulness, right? Where you need to be aware of what's happening first, so that you can know what's going on, and then if need be, you can sort of make the necessary changes. And I know that mindfulness is also a part of the work that you do as well, where it's just so important. You just got to know, right? Because otherwise there's nothing to even talk about.
Yes.
Yeah.
In CFT, we talk about the 10 shop assistants, where you're going shopping at Christmas time, and then you go into the first shop, and the shop assistant's lovely and helpful, gives you suggestions, and then you go to the second shop, and that shop assistant's really lovely as well, and then the third shop's lovely, and you go through these, and then the 10th shop assistant, you walk in there and they're just sort of looking on their phone and they ignore you, and then you ask for help and they kind of grunt and unpleasant, and you're sort of driving home after all of this, and who are you thinking about? You're thinking about the 10th shop assistant. We have these funny brains that really do focus on the negative. I think it's Rick Hansen that sort of says, our brains are Teflon for the positive and Velcro for the negatives, something like that. And it's so true. We're very, and that's threat system stuff. That's to do with the threat system being very powerful, and better to be safe than sorry, only wanting to notice the threats, remember the threats because that'll keep us safe next time, and so on. And so we definitely, have those kind of brains. And mindfulness really is a kind of the foundation and pathway to compassion. If we can just practice being kind of present and aware of the surroundings, of what's happening around us, and kind of coming to our senses, but also bringing mindfulness and awareness of our minds and how that might be kind of functioning in any given moment. And sort of we talk about mindfulness, and we sort of talk about mind awareness in CFT, where we're sort of, and this is one of the really great aspects of that 3 circles model, the 3 emotion regulation systems, is we begin to be able to be aware of our own minds in those kind of terms. My threat system is activated right now. I have a big red circle, and I'm noticing that actually my soothing system is kind of deactivated right now. And how can I perhaps shift from red into green? We often will get people to use the 3 circles as a kind of a monitoring system, where they might even draw the circles in terms of how activated they are in any given moment. And my wonderful colleague James Kirby and Jamin Day, another colleague, are developing an app where you can change the size of the 3 circles, just as a regular monitoring tool to kind of develop that mindfulness, but also that mind awareness in terms of our tricky brains, where they're at right now, and what might I be able to do to kind of influence that a little bit and shift into the green circle.
Yeah, and it also sort of allows the taking of a step back, right? So it's not all consuming when you're looking to evaluate or just notice, as the sort of mindful lexicon goes, just notice what's happening without judgment, right? And that's true. But when you do that, because we have this sort of metacognitive ability of being able to know to just be aware of what's happening rather than having our attention fully consumed by the emotion or the experience, it really changes how we think about, not how we think about it, but it changes the experience of it, because instead of being, just all curled up and just tense and feeling all that fear, and that's just everything that there is in this moment, being able to say, okay, well, just take a breath, and you go, well, what's actually going on? And you're like, okay, my threat system's activated. I can feel it. It feels terrible. I hate it, but I know what's happening, right? And it's not as powerful and controlling at that point. And then, as you say, you can then take steps to, down-regulate that system, various sort of like breathing exercises or relaxation or whatever floats your boat, and also to increase the soothing system at the same time for the good feelings, not just getting rid of the bad ones. Not being a moral judgment, just a discomfort.
Well, this is where I sort of reintroduce the multiplicity into the conversation too, that we mentioned very briefly earlier, the
multiple selves,
and that not only do we start to kind of disentangle threat system and understand that or notice that when it's activated, but we start to even bring further awareness to the different brain and body patterns within perhaps the threat system. So we might start to notice, okay, part of what's kind of online here with me at the moment is my anxious self. There's an anxious self who's worried about what might happen here, and sort of the heart's racing a bit and sort of concerned about sort of what's going to go wrong. But also at the same time, there's a little bit of angry self that's present as well. There's a part of me that's feeling pretty annoyed by all of this and kind of sick of it and feeling like this other person, say, is to blame. But actually, I'm also noticing that in amongst that or behind all of that is also my sad self. There's sadness here because there's a feeling of loss. I feel like I've lost something in amongst this difficult situation, and so there's sadness there as well. And Paul talks about this notion of differentiation, that we start to, he sort of says, we turn the smoothie back into fruit salad. And so we sort of, because sometimes our threat system just feels like it's all this stuff all mixed together, and it's very difficult to comprehend it all. But sometimes if we can understand this notion of multiplicity, and we can start to disentangle the angry part, the anxious part, the sad part, maybe the critical part, maybe the shamed part, but maybe also the compassionate part as well. And then we can bring the compassionate self to the conversation as well. And that's the part that can start to talk to each of the other ones and sort of explore things and start to soothe the anxious self and, kind of reassure the sad self and whatever it might be. And that's, this idea of pattern switching. We try to switch patterns from threat system, body and brain kind of patterns to this compassionate self pattern. And that can, that sort of really, that becomes the real purpose and intention behind CFT is to develop that compassionate self in order to help with these other really difficult, often threat system based parts of ourselves.
Yeah, and you want that to be the dominant one, right? That would be the best way to go in terms of, as far as I can tell, of a way to regulate.
Sometimes we want the anxious system to dominate. Like if I'm walking along and I'm about to cross the street and a bus honks its horn, I don't need my compassionate self running the show at that point. I need to jump out of the way. So, and there might be times when the angry self is particularly, helpful, in terms of fighting an injustice or something, and even the sad self, like perhaps we are, attending the funeral of a friend of a friend's family or parents. Well, I've had that recently, and the sad self is really important there. That's part of the gang that we. So it's not like we want to get rid of all of those.
No.
It's more that the compassionate self brings in that wisdom, strength, courage, caring commitment to kind of be helpful in and amongst all of those different bits.
Yeah. It's more of this sort of like foundation. Maybe we can think about it as all of the other stuff comes out. I mean, listen, the fear stuff's going to happen anyway. That's so hardwired in. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. But the rest of our sort of emotional turbulence maybe is nicely couched in this compassion.
Yes.
For a healthy way of viewing things and of expressing all of the emotions where appropriate, and even maybe not expressing them, just feeling them where appropriate. Yeah.
Sometimes I like to think of the compassionate self is just kind of coming alongside, all of these different elements of ourselves to see if the compassionate self can be helpful, basically. Like
the wise sage walking along the path with you.
Exactly. Yeah.
But anyway, Stan, listen, this has been a really fantastic episode. So thank you very much. You have a really great YouTube channel. People can just look up Stan Steindl. I will put it in the links. You also have a book out called The Gift of Compassion. People can definitely check that out. Is there anything else you'd like to promote? Please do.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, if you give me likes on the YouTube channel, then I'll be very excited. I think the YouTube channel, the books, the gifts of compassion. I also run a compassionate mind training course. If people are interested in any of this stuff, please feel free to be in touch. By all means, include my email address there in the notes if you like, and it'd be lovely to hear from people.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Well, people should check it out. I recommend. And I hope to have you on again soon to continue. It's been really fun. So thank you again.
Great. Thanks, mate.
Take care.